It's a great pleasure to be here at this exciting event, and I hope the unexpected family circumstance that prevented my friend Rafi Hofstein from being with us works out well for him and his family. I'm going to begin my talk this afternoon by asking a question and offering an answer. What are the requirements for a successful innovation ecosystem? There are three. 1, great ideas. 2, R&D to develop them. And 3, the financing to commercialize that R&D. Canada has an abundance of great ideas and of world-class R&D to develop them. That is hardly surprising, given Canada's outstanding institutions of higher learning and exceptional research centers like those here in Nova Scotia, and one of the most highly educated populations in the world. Not to mention federal and provincial government support of R&D under funding programs that are among the most generous and progressive anywhere, where that R&D funding as a percentage of GDP is often ranked among the highest in the world. But Canada has a serious shortage of venture capital to commercialize that world-class R&D into products, revenues, profits, jobs, and exports. That is the commercialization crisis. In the first part of my talk, I'll discuss this crisis, and then the federal government's promising new 2013 venture capital plan to address it, and the lessons taken from Israel to shape that plan. Why is venture capital so critical for commercializing R&D? Simply put, traditional sources of institutional financing, such as banks, are largely unavailable to emerging technology companies because those companies, 1, typically have few bankable hard assets, such as equipment, inventory, and buildings. 2, no positive cash flow. 3, little if any operational history. And 4, profits and sometimes even revenues that may be several, if not many years away. Venture capital is pretty much the only institutional private industry financing available that will assume the risks of funding the commercialization of unproven technologies. Where would we be if there were no VCs to invest in the unproven technologies of small, unstable companies, including those run by college dropouts with no prior business experience, such as Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Michael Dell, and Mark Zuckerberg? Imagine if Bill Gates or Steve Jobs at the beginning had been applying for a bank loan for their new companies. Think of their response to a loan application question entitled, "Describe relevant qualifications." College dropout with no prior business experience. Then to a question entitled, "Describe loan applicant." New company with no assets, cash flow, or operational history. You can imagine the loan officers just drooling to make this loan. And if the loan officer had asked a question atypical for a banker, but not unheard of, "Describe your market." Answer, "Not yet in existence, but I'm working on it." No bank would have been likely to fund these two tiny companies, Apple and Microsoft, now with a combined market cap of $650 billion, or other similar ones in the past, such as OpenText, RIM, Google, Cisco, or Intel. Without venture capital, they and others like them may have died on the vine. And when we ponder all these great venture-backed companies and how they collectively transformed economies and how we now do business around the globe, and when especially we are contemplating how young some of their founding entrepreneurs were, I can't help to further ponder a question. Can any country become an innovation nation if it is unable to fund the next generation technologies of first generation entrepreneurs? It's no accident venture capital is referred to as risk capital. But in addition to capital, top-tier VCs also bring specialized capabilities that even the most gifted young entrepreneur often lacks, but that are essential for successfully commercializing R&D. These include prior entrepreneurial operating company experience, sector and domain industry expertise, and extensive networks in global customer markets. So just how dire is this shortage of venture capital in Canada? In 2010 and 11, the Canadian VC industry experienced its worst fundraising in more than 16 years. While there was a significant uptick in 2012, it was still well below needed levels, with little assurance that it will recur in 2013. Even when Canadian emerging technology companies do obtain VC financing, it's often wholly insufficient. In 2012, Canadian VC-backed emerging technology companies received on average only 44 cents for every dollar of funding received by their VC-backed direct U.S. competitors. Yet these undercapitalized Canadian technology companies must compete in the same global market as their far better financed U.S. competitors, not to mention those from other countries. And the Canadian companies that do get funded encounter great difficulty in achieving follow-on financing, as that is in especially short supply in Canada. What are the consequences for Canada? In the absence of venture capital, the Canadian government's billions of dollars of support for R&D of emerging technology companies is effectively becoming a subsidy to U.S. businesses. Rather than helping promising companies blossom into industry leaders, Canada's technology industry has become, in some respects, a discount market for U.S. companies, which come in, buy many of these promising capital-starved but R&D-rich companies early in their life cycles and at bargain basement prices, and then move them and the future jobs they will create to the U.S. There, those new U.S. owners then reap the financial rewards of that government-sponsored Canadian R&D by commercializing it themselves and bringing those companies to industry leadership. In that sense, the Canadian government's billions of dollars in annual support for R&D of its emerging technology companies is akin to a vast program for creating advanced aircraft when there's no fuel to fly them. What are the causes of this venture capital shortage? 5 come to mind. 1, during roughly the past decade, the Canadian VC industry has performed poorly. It did not help that during that same period, there was a burst technology bubble at the beginning, a serious recession toward its end, and insufficient IPO and M&A liquidity opportunities throughout. 2, because of this poor performance, large Canadian institutional investors that had funded Canadian venture capital firms fled the VC asset class. 3, at the same time, U.S. VC firms that in prior years had accounted for as much as 40% of all VC funding in Canada greatly reduced their investments here because of their own troubles in the U.S. 4, unlike the U.S. VC industry that has been in existence for 60 years with long-standing depth and breadth of experience, Canada's is relatively young, with more than 92% of Canada's VC firms having been formed after 1994. And 5, the vast majority of Canadian VC firms are subscale in size, that is, well below 100 million, with insufficient funds to grow and scale production of the companies in which they invest and to accelerate their sales to enter world markets. In short, these subscale VC firms do not have the funds to systematically invest large amounts over time in potentially big winners and to fund all of the stages of their growth through industry leadership. It is the confluence of these 5 factors and how they continuously and negatively reinforced one another that caused the perfect storm. Not surprisingly, over recent years especially, the federal Canadian government has grown deeply concerned about this crisis and its increasingly adverse impact on Canadian commercialization. And here is where we get to some good news. And I'll bet you're beginning to wonder if I was ever going to get to any good news. And a positive new development in the form of a bold and innovative venture capital program launched by the federal Canadian government in 2013. But before discussing that program, some background. In the course of the Canadian government studying the difficult challenge in its VC industry with a view to coming up with an action plan, Minister Flaherty made a trip to Israel to understand how Israel had successfully met its own daunting venture capital challenge back in 1992. Here is what I believe he would have learned in that visit. In 1992, Israel had no venture capital industry, and its technology companies were in desperate need of funding to develop their products and get them to market. That year, Israel formed a fund of funds with $80 million, and at that time, $80 million was a very sizable amount of money. For those of you who are not familiar with the term fund of funds, it is simply a fund that invests in other venture capital firms rather than in technology companies. That new fund of funds, in turn, then facilitated the creation of 10 new VC firms having Israeli investment managers from the private sector. Each of these 10 new VC firms was to be capitalized with $20 million for a total in all of $200 million, with the government providing $8 million, that is 40% of the funding of each, conditional on the remaining $12 million, that is 60% for each, being raised from foreign private institutional investors. The government also recruited highly qualified foreign VCs to partner with the Israeli VCs in these 10 firms. In creating this new fund of funds, the Israeli government placed a bold and imaginative bet on Israeli technology. Israel's biggest challenge in this initiative was how to find a way to attract foreign institutional investors that would co-invest with the government in these two new VC firms with no track records. To do this, Israel crafted an innovative incentive. It gave the foreign investors the right to buy out the government's 40% investment interest at cost plus interest in 5 years. This buyout right meant that the Israeli government retained the entire downside risk on its 40% investment, while the private investors under their buyout option had all the upside potential on that 40%. This incentive proved more successful than anyone could ever have imagined. The private sector investors all materialized. The new VC firms succeeded, and the buyout rights were fully exercised by 9 of the 10 VC firms' private investors within the 5-year period. So now, fast forward 10 years from 1992, when Israel started this program from scratch, to 2002. Israel, a country of 5 million, with no VC industry in 1992, in 2002 now had 60 VC firms with $10 billion under management. They went from 200 million to 10 billion. VC investment in Israel as a percentage of GDP in 2002 was now the highest in the world. Israel then had more public companies listed on NASDAQ than any other country except the US. And the average size of these 10 original VC firms was then heading to 250 million from their initial 20 million in 1992. In less than a decade, Israel, the size of a not hugely large city, about the size currently of metropolitan Chicago, had catapulted into having the second most significant VC industry in the world. It's true Israel benefited from good timing, including the rising technology tide in the years before the technology bubble burst in 2001, a well-established technology base arising from its military, and the influx in the 1990s of tens of thousands of highly trained scientists and engineers from the former Soviet Union. But the jump-starting of Israel's VC industry into existence is still a remarkable story. Israel's proactive out-of-the-box strategy of offering a highly innovative incentive to experienced foreign investors proved to be the tipping point for attracting these investors to significantly leverage the government's money and enable the Israeli VC industry to succeed. Equally impressive, through the investors' exercise of their buyout right, Israel then went on to recoup substantially all of its $80 million direct investment plus interest. Now fast forward 21 years. In 2013, Canada launched its own $400 million program, VC program, as a catalyst to jump its VC industry. Like Israel's, it will be largely a fund of funds program. It is following the 1992 Israeli venture capital playbook in other important respects, including in offering special incentives to attract an additional $600 million, and the Canadian government hopes that will be $900 million, or more in co-investments largely from private sector investors, for a minimum total of about $1 billion. This $1 billion proposed capital infusion is intended by the Canadian government to kickstart a private, independent, self-sustaining VC industry led and funded by the private sector, the same goal as Israel's. Here's how the new program will work. Of the $400 million in federal funding, as you can see from the slide, the federal government will put a total of $350 million into 4 funds of funds, each of which will be led by a high-quality, experienced private sector investment manager. The $350 million financing for these 4 new funds of funds will break down into $250 million for 2 new national funds of funds in the amount of $125 million each, an additional $100 million for recapitalizing 2 existing Canadian funds of funds in the amount of $50 million each. And as you can also see from the slide, it is intended that the 4 funds of funds will collectively raise at least an additional $600 million from outside investors. And as you can also see, there's another $50 million that will be invested probably in 2013 directly into 3 to 5 high-performing Canadian VC firms, hopefully to at least one here in Nova Scotia. And when Tom was talking about get ready, that's what he meant. You can't get ready too soon to start pitching for that, not to mention for what will follow. The exact incentives the government will give for private sector investors to co-invest this $600 million amount with it in the new funds of funds have yet to be determined, but are expected to clearly follow the Israeli approach in significant ways. Investment managers of the proposed funds of funds and of the VC firms in which they will invest will be required to have a substantial presence in Canada, although not yet defined. That is likely to include having decision makers on the ground in Canada. This would allow foreign investment managers to open offices in Canada and partner with local ones in the new funds of funds and in the VC firms in which they will invest. Enabling participation of top-tier foreign investment managers as partners is also a lesson from Israel. As happened in Israel, the foreign top-tier investment managers selected would also bring with them to Canada their additional network of significant relationships in major global customer and capital markets. They can also be bridges to the large, higher-priced exits available in the U.S. and other foreign jurisdictions with capital markets. VC firms receiving capital from any of the new funds of funds will be required to invest at least a third of their total capital in Canadian domiciled companies, with the remaining 2/3 investable anywhere in the world. This investment flexibility to invest outside of Canada will enable strong relationships with other foreign global investors and markets. These cross-border relationships, in turn, will lead to those same foreign global investors co-investing in Canadian companies with the Canadian VC firms. The ability of these VC firms to invest outside of Canada is different from the Israeli model, where I believe all the money had to be invested in Israel. In 2013, the reality of globalization is far more advanced than it was in 1992. We live in a world in which markets, capital, and technology have no borders, and I believe the government of Canada made the right decision in allowing for that latitude. I think the Canadian government has taken the right lessons from Israel's experience in its new federal VC program. For the following, and this is a summary of where it has come out. 1, build a VC industry to be led and funded by the private sector. 2, put up substantial public funding to kickstart that industry, but play no role in its investment management. In short, stand back and later get out. 3, incentivize the private sector to fund the VC industry in an amount greater than the government's. 4, structure the program so that well-connected top-tier foreign investment managers and institutional investors can partner with Canadian ones in the new funds of funds. So the government of Canada, armed with the lessons from Israel, is off to a strong start with a well-thought-out plan. At the same time, it should be also noted that Canada possesses significant advantages in 2013 that Israel did not in 1992, and that augur well for the new program. Unlike Israel in 1992, Canada in 2013 does not have to start a VC industry from scratch. Its VC industry has a 30-year history and existing talent and experience. Canada will be reinventing rather than inventing a VC industry. Unlike Israel, Canada has extremely close proximity to the U.S., location of the largest customer and capital markets in the world. And Canada's domestic market, when measured in population and GDP, is well over 4 times the size of Israel's. Canada's VC program is a promising new beginning. And yes, there will be challenges ahead in its implementation. But the Canadian government has taken a bold and innovative step forward. This gives me hope and confidence that there is now a path to fulfilling the essential requirement for a successful innovation ecosystem. And this is where we began. A robust venture capital industry that can do justice to Canada's innovative ideas and world-class R&D, and above all, to the talent and aspirations of the Canadian people. Thank you.